Well, it's oil change day here for the 450RL, and if you own this bike, you probably know that if you're changing the oil yourself, that it could be potentially a very stressful job, but we're going to hopefully end the stress with an additional feature here from a very prominent taco enthusiast. So if you're familiar with the various Facebook groups or with TACOMOTOCO themselves, you know exactly what this is. This is their aftermarket drain bolt for Honda OEM replacements. And with this one, that has a couple of features which make it a little bit easier, a lot less stressful when it comes time to actually cracking this thing loose. So we're going to install that while we do our oil change, but at the same time, I also want to see whether or not this drain bolt as it sits is going to be a headache. This is actually going to be a little interesting because I actually filmed the last oil change that I did with this, and if you saw that video, if not, the link's right there, but I came across a very, very tight drain bolt, and I never tightened the drain bolt to spec. Spec has something like 13 foot-pounds of torque on it, which makes no sense to me because it has an O-ring, so you shouldn't really need to torque it, you just need to seat it. That's what I did last time. I just snugged it tight, and that's it. And so I'm hoping that means when I come to loosen the drain bolt this time, it'll be nice and easy. And it's almost like I'm setting myself up for a tough time because at the same time right now, I also want to point out that this engine is ice cold. It has not been turned on at all. It's just been sitting here for a few days actually. And that's probably not going to make my job any easier, but we're going to at least just try to pry it off as it is. And then if it doesn't, I know the first step here is going to be turning on the bike, letting it warm up, get up to operating temperature so that the metals here can have a chance to expand. Then we'll try it again. But first, let's get a drain pan under here and see what we're talking about. Is it as tight as I think it might be? Oh my God. Okay, people are gonna think that that was like rigged or something like that. I promise it was not. Wow, that was way too easy. Here I am just like thinking this is going to be an absolute nightmare to take off, and it actually, that was so easy. I put in like no effort at all. We can almost end it right here, right now. That's the tip, really, honestly, people, is just to have this tight, basically like finger tight to seat the oil ring on here, and then just a little bit more. That's all that this thing takes. And it was completely fine. Like, obviously there's oil dripping out of it. It's not like it lost any because it was so loose. It's not loose when you have an O-ring. Well, I'll be honest, I was hoping for a little bit more of a struggle there so that way I can kind of justify the TACOMOTO plug a little bit more than the OEM one, but we're gonna keep going with this because I have the part already and there are a couple of features that I do like about the TACOMOTO plug that the OEM does not have. So besides the obvious here, I mean, they both have the same thread pitch, they both have O-rings, nothing special about that, but a couple of things about the TACOMOTO is that it has underneath here a very solid, substantial magnet, just a little bit of preventative measurements right there that I really appreciate. Other big difference here is the type of bolt that is used to actually tighten or loosen the drain bolt. This one has a 10mm hex, which is a little uncommon, but this one is much more common. I'd say 17mm, I believe, and you would see a 17mm socket much more often in a toolkit than you would a 10mm hex. And finally, it's the difference in materials. The OEM here is steel, whereas the TACOMOTO, like the engine block, is aluminum. And because it's the same as the engine block, the heating and cooling rate at which this will expand, contract with heat cycles should match the engine block a lot more so than a steel bolt drain would. And that way it's not going to come across that instance, which I didn't have this time, but I definitely did the last time I changed my oil, where this could potentially tighten itself over time because of that difference in heat cycles. Also has this funny picture of a man named Mike with a taco for a hat. So that's something. While we're letting the residual oil drain out before we put the drain bolt back, let's make this also into a how-to video of how to change your oil, in case you don't know. So obviously we're going to change the filter as well. That's this piece right here. You might have a plastic piece over this covering it, so you'd have to take off that first if you have that, but if not, 1-2 bolts, that's it, and then it'll all pop out as an assembly. I actually forgot about this, but last time I changed the oil, I actually put an aftermarket magnet on the backside here of the oil filter as kind of a preventative measure, again, because I didn't have the magnetic oil drain plug. And it looks like there's actually a little bit of stuff on there, but it's kind of more like liquidy at this point. It's not really chunks, which is a good thing. I definitely don't want chunks in there, but I'm glad it picked up a little bit of something, some extra little particulates that otherwise would have just been floating around in there. So we'll clean this off too, and then put it on the new one. And we'll make sure to put the spring on the back side of this filter. Also put a little bit of oil on this rubber seal here before we pop it back onto the cover. Also give the inside here just a little bit of a clean. Now I can fit this whole bad boy in there, making sure that it's going in nice and square. And don't worry if you're not sure which one is at the bottom or the top, you'll tell because it's off center. Same with the bolts. There is a very large one here, goes on the bottom, and a very short one. This goes on top. Torque specs here, I go with the German spec, Guten Tight. They're only 8mm bolts, so don't go crazy on them. Also for anyone else changing their oil, do you find it really hard to get to this as it is? Because it's really tight fit in here to try and pinch and twist that thing off. I always end up taking this actually out and off of the cover right here, just to move it to the side so I get a little bit more room and can actually get a grip on it like that and actually loosen this thing up and take it out. All right, now it's no longer dripping. Now for the fun part, which is putting the drain bolt in here. First thing I'm gonna do is take this towel, which has a little bit of oil on it, and just kind of dab through the threads as well as the O-ring because I wanna make sure that that's nice and lubricated. I was actually mistaken, this is not a 17, it's a 19. Still a more common size than you would normally use than a 10mm hex, but we're just gonna get this threaded on here. There we go. It might be hard to see, but right there is actually a little arrow. And this is intended to replace the actual torque spec. This is supposed to be tightened so that arrow actually lines up. Well, it's supposed to be over here, but I think I threaded it on the wrong way, so that must be something that you want to make note of if you want to use that. Let me actually loosen this and see if I can get it to line up.
2 hours later.
Okay, well, I unthreaded and threaded that thing on way too many times, and every time it was still going to this spot. Okay, well, that's what I get for doing this on the fly. Actually, I just literally tightened that thing just until it stopped going with barely any torque at it whatsoever, and now the arrow actually is up here. So I immediately retract what I just said, so you could actually give it a little oomph. I'm not gonna go as far as this arrow is saying to go. You can kind of imagine this as a straight line across, and so it will go right here, but I'm not going to go that far. This is plenty snug. It's definitely more than finger tight, and as you saw previously, that's how I torqued the last one, and everything came off nice and easy, and there was no oil lost. So that's how you do it. But we're not quite done yet. Of course, we need to put new oil in after we've drained all the oil, so this is going to be 1.1 liters worth. Well, now we fully completed an oil change, and with this drain bolt, it should be a lot easier. Although that said, it was actually pretty easy to begin with. I guess if anything, I'll just leave you with one tip, and that is to never, ever, 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 did you get that? Ever torque this thing to spec. Just make sure that it's seated and give it a little bit extra. It'll be perfectly fine. It's not going to drop any oil. It's not going to go loose or anything like that. It'll just make your life that much easier in another 600,000 miles when you go to change the oil again.